Hello, I'm Frank Gaffney with the Center for Security Policy, and I'm very happy to say with the former Commandant of the Marine Corps, the 30th Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Carl Mundy. General Mundy has been associated with causes of great importance for a long time, both during his service to our country and in his post-government life, one of which I'm happy to say was as the founding member of the Center's Military Committee. He's gone on to many other important good works, and none arguably is more important than the leadership role that he has been playing in trying to protect the Marine Corps and the Armed Forces of the United States more generally against a real, grave, and present danger that is being posed incredibly, not by an enemy, but by our own government. Namely, the idea of having the United States Armed Forces subjected to a politically driven social experiment in the interest of satisfying a vocal minority that seek to repeal a law prohibiting open homosexuals from serving in the United States Armed Forces. General Mundy has recently written an extraordinary letter to members of the United States Senate who are being asked by the President in the very short time available in this lame duck session to repeal that law. And General Mundy, I want to say, first of all, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for our long and wonderful association, but most especially, thank you for this letter. It is, in my 30-odd years in government and out and observing government, the single most extraordinary piece of correspondence I've seen. It's just exemplary, and I want to salute you for it, and thank you for putting it before members of the Senate at a critical moment. And what I'd like to do with you today is just walk through a number of the points that you've made here, which are so commonsensical, so thoughtful, that all of us, those who elect members of the Senate as well as those who are serving in it, need to be thinking about before this very, very portentous step is taken. So let me start with a point that you've made about the nature of the military itself. And before we get into what is involved in military service, I thought your introductory point to members of the Senate about the rights that men and women serving in uniform voluntarily give up, which affects their ability to, among other things, petition the Congress, which all the rest of us not only have but take for granted. What are the implications of those kinds of restrictions on those men and women in uniform?
Well, Frank, I think you start at the beginning, and to size it, less than 1% of the population of America serves in the uniform of the armed forces. These are all volunteers. The draft went out 38 years ago, so everybody that's there is there as a volunteer. Everybody who is there as part of the enlistment or the commissioning process, and all people that are commissioned generally enlist before they're commissioned, do so with an affirmation of support for the Constitution, which gives to the Congress the authority and the responsibility to make the rules for the government of the armed forces. Those rules require those who serve to give up or to be limited in rights that ordinary Americans enjoy. You don't have the right to quit your job. If you do, after you've taken a contract, how many people sign a contract to go to work? Some do, not all do. No. But those who would quit on the outside might lose some compensation for that. In the military, you would be hunted down by the marshals and brought back in as a deserter. You give up your rights to individuality. You dress uniformly. That's what uniform means, one kind. Everybody looks alike for a reason. You wear your hair in a different style. You cannot politically demonstrate in your uniform out on the mall demanding something of Congress or otherwise. So you have great restrictions imposed on you. You have no preference for who you serve with or who you live with. Those are rights in the ordinary society that you can do. You can live in Maryland, or you can live in Virginia in an apartment or in a house. You can't do that in the military. So, and you could go on with a long list, but the fact is that you give up a lot of, so to speak, inalienable rights that others have. And again, you do that by swearing an oath of allegiance to the very document and to the very laws that restrict those rights. You promise, you swear to support those and to obey the orders of the President as the Commander-in-Chief and of the officers appointed over you. Civilians don't do that.
It goes without saying, but it's worth mentioning that you do all of that for the opportunity to get killed in the service of your country. I mean, it's really an amazing thing, and you're absolutely right that so few of us have a first-hand connection to the military, and I'm quite sure that that's contributing to a lot of the political ferment that we're seeing at the moment. But we'll talk about that. But I wanted just to capture in a wonderful turn of phrase you have in your letter to members of the Senate this point. You said, quote, "Can you cite any other citizens group anywhere that functions in this one hand tied behind your back and the other in respectful and obedient salute circumstance only for the privilege of serving our nation and the honor of defending it?" That really captures it brilliantly, and I can't think of any other group that even remotely comes close to
you won't
trying
find
to
it.
exercise that kind of restraint. Yeah. Let's talk a bit about the extent to which there is often suggested a right to serve in the United States Armed Forces, that you have any citizen of this country equally entitled to live under the kind of strictures that you've just talked about. You point out in the letter it ain't necessarily so. How is it, and is it uniquely with respect to this business about homosexuality?
Well, it is not unique to that. I mean, there are many restrictions on the qualifications to serve, and they're imposed not for discriminatory. It is discriminating, but they're not imposed for discriminatory reasons. They're imposed for the effectiveness of the military. People who are overweight can't serve. They may be patriotic as all get out, but they're a risk, a liability. My next door neighbor's son, I watched him grow up for 14 years. He is now a big, strapping, about 6'2" kid, played every sport and everything. He wants nothing more for his whole childhood. As he was growing up, he'd come to my house and borrow books and look at my stuff on the walls and whatnot, to be a Marine. He has 2400 vision. He can't be. And so he's out working, and he's going to be a very successful member of society, but he can't because there are restrictions upon him. The Congress, in its wisdom, 17 years ago, passed the law. It is not don't ask, don't tell. That is not the law. That's a policy that has nothing to do with the law. The law was based...
We'll talk about it, actually.
Yeah,
It subverts
okay.
the law, but we'll come back to that, too.
The law is based on military effectiveness. It is based on 11 findings that if all of America would read those findings, the first one of which says, to get to your point, there is no constitutional right to serve in the armed forces of America. So you don't have a right to serve. You volunteer to serve, and you give up certain of your rights in order to serve that.
In a way, I guess, for those of us in civilian life who may not have, again, this experience of the military, it's kind of like driver's licenses in a very micro way. You don't have a right to drive a car. You have to be qualified. You have to pass certain tests in order to do so.
Good analogy.
And demonstrate, in some way, shape, or form, at least a competency that allows the society to say, yeah, we actually want you to be doing this. The Congress enacted this law. You mentioned some of its findings. After considerable deliberation, how would you compare what was gone through back in 1993 with what we are in the midst of now in terms of this effort to rescind, or technically speaking, repeal the law?
Well, I wasn't a member of Congress, but to my knowledge, and I know that I'm accurate on this, there were 12 hearings, there were field trips, there was, exploration of the issue by the Congress. We've had a study that's been done by some
And
very
sustained
fine men.
debate about
Yeah,
that
yeah,
in the course of the
and a
hearings and
lengthy
on the floor.
debate
Yeah.
about it, and an eventual conclusion as to what was good for the effectiveness of the armed forces.
If I may again interrupt.
Yeah.
Overwhelming bipartisan majorities on both sides of Capitol Hill, which,
Yeah.
as I
Okay.
recall, is precisely why it is the law of the land, because had Bill Clinton been able to veto the law, which he did not favor,
Mhm.
he certainly would have. And
Yeah,
we'll get to the don't
it
ask,
was
don't tell piece of
veto-proof,
it.
yeah.
But just compare that 12 hearings, extensive debate, year-long, as I recall, deliberation by the Congress with what's afoot now.
Well, again, some would argue that, look, there has been a study done by the Department of Defense. It's taken almost a year to do that. That's different than the Congress focusing on the issue. The Department of Defense, of which I was a proud member, and I believe is led by one of the finest secretaries that has ever held the job and served by some of the finest people in uniform, but it doesn't make the rules, the Congress does. The Congress has got to take the time to look carefully at this issue and not to shove it through because it's something that has to be done before Christmas. It doesn't have to be done anytime soon.
Right.
So I believe
And
it's
even if-
critically important that
even
the
if
time be taken.
What took a year to be prepared serves as the basis for that action by the Congress, it certainly should be something that they take some time to study and review and have proper hearings about. I gather there are 2 hearings that are being proposed now in the Senate Armed Services Committee. Again, from the perspective of someone who appreciates, as you do, what the implications of this thing might be, how would you regard that kind of deliberative process by contrast with the previous one?
Well, I think it's too fast.
Yeah.
I think it's not very deliberative. You use the word deliberative process. I'm not sure of the
It would
depth of the
qualify.
deliberation, yes.
Yeah, got it. A very interesting set of facts that you introduce in this letter to the Senate involves the numbers of people that are in question here. Endlessly, we're told by those who seek the repeal of this legislation that in time of war, the military can't afford to turn away anybody that wants to serve, and that there are large numbers of people with very important skill sets, particularly linguists, who are being driven out of the service in droves because of this so-called don't ask, don't tell policy. The data that you've supplied to members of the Senate suggests otherwise. Can you give us a flavor of what the facts are as you see them?
I don't know how many people are homosexuals in the armed forces. I think it is far less than you would believe from reading the hyperbole. If you listen to or read what you believe, what you read every day, you would think that every other member was, but that's just not the case. And I think those serving today would tell you that. I use the example that in the Marine Corps, my service, I can speak most easily to that. Last year, 32,400 and some additional number over that were discharged from service, and that's a fairly ordinary number. That's about the same every year. Of that number,
Discharged mostly honorably.
that are
and
discharged,
simply
sure,
leave
sure,
the
that have
service
finished their
in the
service
normal
and go on
process.
to become productive members of the private sector out here. Of that number, 78 were discharged for reasons that would be associated with don't ask, don't tell, to pick up on the euphemism. Of that 78, more than half were still in entry-level training. What does that mean? It means boot camp, or maybe one of the formative schools that follows after boot camp. You don't even have your occupation specialty assigned yet. You are
Let alone
at
been
most
trained up for it and
qualified,
so on.
much less skilled. And that was half the people that were discharged from the Marine Corps last year. I can't speak to the other services. But the fact that there is a hemorrhage of skill loss is just not true. There are undoubtedly individual examples that you can pick out as icons of the repeal activists, but they are not in great numbers.
Yeah. In fact, you cited a Congressional Research Service study from 2009, which says, quote, the majority of these discharges involve junior personnel with limited skills that derive from voluntary admissions and are uncontested, and most receive honorable discharges. So this would seem to be a manageable, if not absolutely trivial, problem. By contrast with which, you have described both some of the evidence that even the Pentagon's own new study suggests, as well as some earlier polling data about the number of people who may choose to separate from the service, who are currently serving, and who actually have experience and skills that would feel the need to, well, as I guess the chairman of the Joint Chiefs has put it, vote with their feet. Give us a sense, in your estimation, General Mundy, of how significant a problem this might actually be for those now in the service.
They've told us that. They've told us that in surveys. Again, you make reference to one that was conducted of active duty military people a year or maybe a couple of years ago, in which of the survey population, 10% of those who were surveyed said that if the law was repealed and open homosexuality were made the rule of the armed forces, that they would not continue after their enlistment expired. Now, again, this is an obedient population. They did not say, we will riot, we will storm out the front gate. They said simply, we won't re-enlist. I suspect that there is some inflation in that. But Frank, if only 1%, vice the 10% that said they would, if only 1% of those go, that's 24,000 skilled people in their second or third enlistments that over a 1 to 3 year period have said that we would lose them. Now that is a loss.
Right.
That's very significant, and in addition to that, another 14% indicated that they would think about it. So,
this again is a result of a study or poll done by the
Military Times newspaper.
So not a newspaper known for its opposition to the repeal of this law by any means.
Pretty liberal.
This indicates that you have a body of people with skills in the service who would separate. The numbers may be substantially larger or substantially smaller, but nonetheless, skilled people. You were among the organizers of a group of senior military officers like yourself who said in their estimation that the impact of this kind of loss could be very real. Can you tell us about that assessment and whether you in fact continue to feel, based on the surveys and so on that the Pentagon has just released, that that's a correct assessment?
Well, we believe then, and we tried to convey respectfully to the President and to the members of Congress, our belief that this would impact recruiting. There probably is still a perception in America that the people that join the military are people that can't find a job or that can't do anything else. That's just patently not true. If you talk to recruiters today, there may be some that come, but the work pickup corners and the pool halls are not the domain of recruiters. The kitchen tables with mom and dad present to discuss this with their young person that's considering the armed forces is more the norm than certainly it was in my day. There are some educated young people that choose to come into the armed forces. So, first of all, they are a quality person. I'm drifting off your point here, but they represent a great investment by the nation. We train them, we equip them, we outfit them, we give them skills to use in the military. And if they choose to leave because of a circumstance with which they cannot live or don't agree or whatever the reason, that's a tremendous loss. Especially
if it's not conducive or supportive of some purpose like enhancing the military effectiveness.
Sure.
That's the thing this is a gratuitous burden and affront to these folks. In that regard, let's go back to this don't ask, don't tell business. In your letter to the Senate, you have made a pretty strong point, I think rightly so, that the confusion between the law on the one hand and this so-called don't ask, don't tell policy on the other may actually be purposeful. But let's just clarify what the differences are between the two and why, at the very least, it's unhelpful to have this confusion persisting.
The law is very specific. It says simply, if you exhibit a propensity or if you behave in a way that exhibits that you are homosexual, then you are not eligible to serve. No penalties, you just simply are not eligible to serve. It requires no one to lie. You don't have to lie on your enlistment form. You don't have to lie at any point. You just are not eligible. Don't ask, don't tell was an accommodation, political accommodation, that sought to allow those who were gay, lesbian, bisexual, to serve if they didn't tell. And that's the we won't ask, don't ask, there's no question on your enlistment contract, and you don't tell. That was an accommodation, but it is an accommodation that is counter to the law.
Yeah, but by the way, an accommodation as much as anything of Bill Clinton, who has, as we just were talking about, opposed the law and had made commitments, much as Barack Obama has had, to help advance this homosexual agenda, and came up with this through a Defense Department regulation, as I recall, as a sort of, well, workaround, I guess you'd call it in the military. What are the implications? Because the Secretary of Defense, of whom you've just spoken very highly, Robert Gates, has made this somewhat impassioned statement the other day in support of repeal of the law and promoting this survey, which he says justifies doing so, that this is all about integrity. And I know you are an example, exemplar really, of integrity in the military, and I think that's what brings you to this topic. What do you say to someone like the Secretary of Defense about the importance of preserving integrity and the fact that we have something that clearly does cause problems in that department?
Well, I think that I've heard as recently, I was watching some of the testimony this morning, and there was a testimony, I believe, by the chairman in which he brought up this point: how can you ask people to lie? The law doesn't ask you to lie. The policy may, but when you have, even at the highest levels of government, either a lack of understanding or an intentional spin put on the law to suggest that it causes what don't ask, don't tell imposed, that would question integrity, perhaps.
Right.
It's not being honest about the law and what the law requires.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems to me that if something's to be repealed here, it should be the policy.
Sure.
Not the law.
Yeah, and that's a stroke of a pen if somebody chooses to do that.
If that is in fact causing people to lie and causing a threat to the integrity of the armed forces, which I certainly agree is central to the military good order and discipline, as I know you know. One last thing. We have heard from those other than the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon that they continue to have real concerns about this. I guess their testimony will be coming up shortly as we're talking today. One of them is the newest Commandant of the Marine Corps, General James Amos, who, as you know, has just recently spoken rather forcefully in a way that seems to track with the sentiments of a lot of his troops. What weight should be given to these service chiefs in their judgments of their troops' beliefs, preferences, needs, and how would you evaluate those relative to these other prominent figures in the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman?
Well, the service chiefs are undoubtedly closer. I mean, the Commandant of the Marine Corps goes out and spends his time with Marines or the Chief of Staff of the Army or the Chief of Naval Operations or the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. They're in contact. They bear the responsibility for recruiting, training, organizing, equipping, managing. If you get to when you get to the end of the stick, retiring, burying, whatever it may be, those are responsibilities that the service chiefs bear. The Secretary of Defense, certainly in a collective sense, bears that same responsibility. The chairman, who is an experienced naval officer and certainly has views that should be heard and has given them. But he does not have specific responsibilities with regard to the personnel matters in the armed services or to the oversight of those individual armed services. The Chief of Staff of the Army does, the Commandant does, the others in the hierarchy do. So it is, in my judgment, ultra important that the Congress, in hearing views, hear those of the service chiefs. It is they who represent the troops in uniform. And that just makes sense to me.
Do you have any concern, General Mundy, that the same kinds of pressure that has clearly been brought to bear on some officers, I think in fact General Amos was dressed down by the chairman, may impede their ability to speak candidly to the United States Senate or to others who are looking for their best professional judgment on this repeal issue?
They are men at the present time, all men, who bear a great responsibility and who stand astride a barbed wire fence in giving their views. Because on the one hand, they are serving officers with obedient responsibility to the Commander-in-Chief and to the Secretary of Defense who represents the Commander-in-Chief, and they understand that. And for that reason, when they go forth to the Congress, they give their best professional views. The Congress may ask them as well their personal views, and that's where it gets a little bit dicey because they are men of integrity and they will speak their personal views, but only if asked by the Congress. Otherwise, they will represent the professional views. I suspect in this issue that the personal views and the professional views will not be far apart. So we have to trust them. I mean, they are the leaders of those organizations. Who else would you ask?
Right.
It serves no real purpose to ask somebody coming up out of a subway or on the streets or somewhere to go out and say, what do you think about homosexuality? And they may be in the 99% of the country that's never served in the armed forces. So their opinion may be interesting, but it bears no weight compared to those that are responsible, not just to, yes, the President and the Secretary of Defense, but to the Congress and to the mothers and fathers that lend their sons and daughters to the service of this country, and the spouses and the people that depend on them. When we went through this in 1993, I dare say that there were few letters that went to from Marines or from Marine spouses or from the parents of Marines that went to somebody else other than me. And many of them said, look, if this happens, my son is coming out. It's your responsibility, General, to stand up for them. So these men will stand up for those in uniform.
Yeah. They've all, I believe, said under oath to the Senate Armed Services Committee that they would provide their professional, personal views at very least, if asked. So I trust that that will be forthcoming. I said finally, let me just add one last thing. You've heard the argument made that if we don't repeal the law, if the Congress of the United States doesn't set the rules, then it will be left to the courts to do it. And there's this Judge Virginia Phillips, federal judge out in California, who has said all of this is unconstitutional, this law prohibiting open homosexuals from serving in the military, and has said worldwide that the Defense Department must cease and desist its efforts to enforce the law. There's been a stay on that. We'll see how this plays out in the courts, but you've raised a very important point here, which I've not heard elsewhere, about how this might actually work out in a way very much at odds with what the Congress is being told would be the case if they fail to repeal. So walk us through that, if you would, sir.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but as I understand the law and in my detailed look at that, a district court has ruled, and of course the Pentagon reacted to that and suspended, the policy for a short time. And then when the Court of Appeals stayed that judgment, we went back into the law. If the law is repealed now, before the Circuit Court of Appeals renders judgment on Judge Phillips' judgment, that judgment will be standing. It will be legal precedent. And what it means is that the Congress, any law that the Congress makes in the future, or that the services establishes regulations is subject to challenge on the basis of the legal precedent of the judgment that has already been issued by Judge Phillips. The Congress would be abdicating its constitutional authority to make the laws for the government of the armed forces if they act before this particular appeals court, which I think is scheduled sometime toward the end of January to even take up the issue. So it's a very dangerous ice pond to be walking on here.
Right.
If you act now, you risk abdicating your constitutional authority.
So far from actually preserving the power of the Congress to make the laws, you're saying that were they to repeal this one now, at this stage of the judicial process, they would be absolutely ceding power, authority, responsibility to this other branch that was never envisioned to exercise it by the framers.
To my understanding of the law,
Yeah.
there has long been judicial deference to the authority of the Congress with regard to the armed forces. The Supreme Court has on more than a few occasions upheld that authority of the Congress, and I believe will in this case at hand, if it gets to the Supreme Court, if it isn't settled in the appeals court. But without that, what basis would the Supreme Court have at any point in the future to come back and rule in favor of the Congress because you've got a precedent
Yeah.
that just poked a hole in that?
And not just on this issue of homosexuality, but
I
you're saying
think on any
anything else
issue,
that
on
any
any
judge
issue.
decides they want to weigh in on.
Yeah.
You've been very generous with your time, General. Let me just ask a concluding sort of summary. You have described the limitations that operate on men and women in uniform today expressing themselves. We've talked about the complexities of the issue in terms of public awareness of it in the civilian society and the confusion that has either been deliberately fomented or has simply happened as a result of a law on the one hand that's very clear and a policy that is seemingly designed at least to make it less clean-cut and maybe even to subvert the law. You've talked about the military effect that this particular change could have. In closing, what would you say to the Congress of the United States, the Senate most immediately, about the impending question of whether they should take this up, this repeal, in this lame duck session on the basis of nothing more than basically 2 days of hearings and this survey that's been produced just recently by the Pentagon?
Someone in the Congress has got to ask the question, because it has not been given elsewhere, what is the benefit of repealing the law? We've heard, again, in the hyperbole around that it allows patriotic Americans to serve, but we talked earlier, there are a lot of patriotic Americans that can't serve. It's not a matter of patriotism, it's a matter of military effectiveness, and anything that jeopardizes that is, in my judgment, very risky and should not be undertaken. I think the Congress has got to take the time to study this issue, deliberate on it, as you have used the term. That's what they are there for, is to very carefully think this through, very carefully look at the details that have been provided to them. And if they come to the conclusion that it's time to overturn the law, then, we obey the law and we respect the judgment of the Congress, but only after it has taken the time to deliberate. So my advice would be, take the time. There is no compelling reason to do what is being sought to be done at this time or in any time frame that I can see in the immediate future.
Yeah. General Mundy, thank you for your leadership and thank you for this extraordinary contribution to that deliberative process.
Staggering.
I hope
It's
it'll help.
staggering.
It is indeed.